Turk was the most admired guy in the world of traditional jazz. You got to understand, he's an iconic figure, but more than that.
When Turk finally left the Yerba Buena band, for some time he had a vision in his head of how he thought the music ought to be. Scobie and Turk recorded with their own groups, mainly Yerba Buena Jazz Band sidemen, at the end of 1947.
Well, Turk was a different guy. Both Lou and Turk had in common this passion for the music and music of the era. And Turk was also a great devotee of the earlier form, and he was expert. He really had dug into the music, along with Lou. He had been a part of the thing of helping form the band, getting the music, making suggestions and all that. And but he was a different type person.
I don't think the musical differences were too important. I think that it was mostly a matter of economy, and I think the musical differences, whatever they were more minor than major.
Turk always looked at his band and his repertoire as a large body of literature that paid tribute to King Oliver, J.L. Earl Morton, the great Louis Armstrong, the greats. That he decided he didn't like the term Dixieland. So he coined the term traditional jazz in order to separate it from what was being played in New York.
Turk was much more organized, did not have this bohemian part of his character, understood a little more about PR and friendships and how they could help you in the business. Turk was willing to travel.
Town is full of guys who think they're mighty wise just because they know a thing or two. You can see them every day strolling up and down Broadway, telling of the wonders they can do. Now you see wise guys and...
Turk was performing a lot of high-profile jobs. They would go in the early 1950s, mid to early 1950s, the Turk Murphy Jazz Band would go to New York every year and do a series of concerts and club residencies. One of the most prominent ones was when they played at the Child's Restaurant, and a big place. Lottie Lania came to the show, and it was a big deal to Turk, and they eventually ended up recording together in that era on the Columbia Records when Turk had a record deal.
That is their age in the hole. Now they'll tell you of money that they...
We played 1 week in Philadelphia and 4 weeks in Boston and 2 weeks in Milwaukee. People came to Milwaukee from Michigan and all over Wisconsin and Minnesota and Illinois. We didn't expect to feel very much at home, but the reception started out with a bang and continued.
That old ace in the hole.
In that era, in the early 1950s, touring, record sales was all part of what you had to do to be a national band actor, a national band leader, which Turk believed he was, and he really was.
We were sort of surprised to come into New York and find that our records had preceded us and made such a definite move towards establishing a style we call San Francisco. It seems like we had innumerable friends there who got the word around that we were coming to town. I heard the comment in New York amongst people, fans who came down quite often at the club, that they never had seen so many people out on the floor dancing, people that hadn't danced for years. this trip to New York and recording for Columbia in their studios on 30th Street there. It's been, actually, I might say, to play in their recording studios at Columbia and also Victor are musical therapy to me.
He worked his way into making big records for Columbia with a wide distribution. Some of his records were very good selling records. So he became more of a national figure with more going on, many more years than Lou Waters did. He was a better businessman, although there were flaws in his business approach. He was a better businessman than Lou, but that's not saying much because Lou was not a good businessman at all.
Turk Murphy was a revolutionary in the way he looked at his music. He perceived the music as being a body of work, of a literature of music that he contributed to as a composer and an arranger. Turk did a lot of work for television and different things, and I think the best example of that would be his short compositions for Sesame Street.
5, 6, 7. Said the alligator king to his 7 sons, I'm feeling mighty down.
The greatest example of Turk's ability to arrange was when he wrote music for the show Storyville, a show that he put together.
Do you also add to your repertoire original tunes composed by your own?
We do this.
players?
Bob Helm and myself are composing most original tunes now. We have, between Bob and myself, we have about 45 or 50 tunes.
Are these in the style of
the style of the original band. Of course,
I see.
This style is quite varied. It's various colors of tunes. I mean, each person that writes one has a different concept too. I think it should sound. We try to keep the music alive rather than let it remain static.
The most well-known activity that Turk had was the Earthquake Magoons Club, and he had it at several locations. But the most famous one is the club on Clay Street.
I'm Rosie, the queen of the models. I used to live up in the Bronx. I've wandered from there down to Washington Square in those bohemian...
Turk put on sort of a show. He'd always have a singer. He had something going on at intermissions.
Charlie Adams. He said, I'm like
He'd always have either a pianist or he'd have Clancy Hayes was a banjo player, a singer. He was a good entertainer. You'd have him on at intermissions. So it was, the music just kept going. And he always had something like, it was good, you know. He really did a good job.
He gets a raggy notion, starts a syncopated notion of
I mean, the layout of the club, the way that was set up, the bar, the dance floor, the bandstand, it was about as fine a club. I've never seen a better one in my life than that club of Turk's. And you know, Turk was the kind of guy, he'd fix the plumbing and he'd build this and he'll do that. But not only that, but he saw to it that club ran right, staffed, and he was always working on promotion and connection with people in town and that sort of thing. So he was good at all those things.
A lot of what motivated Turk was to get crowds at Magoons, and the better known he was and the more in the public eye he was in general helped the business at Magoons, which incidentally was quite good in the 1960s. Although the rock and roll world started taking a chunk out of their business.
We found opposition, but we also found friends.
San Francisco was a town that took care of its own in those days. And Turk knew that, and he was very aware of how he fit into San Francisco and cultivated the city fathers and the people who could help him in order to keep Magoons running for decades. And he ran the club from the 60s to the for the early, like 1980s.
We're broadcasting live from Earthquake Magoons. Come down and join us tonight. And you know there's only one.
In the earlier years, some of the musicians were more freewheeling, and Turk was a little bit uncomfortable with some of that kind of playing. But as the band went on into the late 70s into the early 80s, the recordings suggest that Turk had a much stronger influence over the musicians playing. By the 1970s and 80s, Turk had come into his own as an arranger and composer, and he'd really established a sound. And I think that the biggest difference from the band's point of view sonically was that Turk insisted on the band playing his arrangements basically as written. People's pathways to that band vary considerably. There were people who would inquire with Turk, write him letters and say, I really want to join your band. And sometimes that worked. But there are also times when he had to pick people up along the way.
And I knew about Turk before I was ever really ready to play with him, you know. So I knew a lot about Turk's music, and I was paralleling with the knowledge I had of Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. I knew that Turk was doing something that no one else was really doing very strongly. As far as I knew, he was trying to keep that music alive. I was able to get friendly with a guy that was actually the vice president of Corning Glass. His name was Cam Rutledge. So Cam told me, he said, hey, you know, I know you like Turk, and we're having him in our country club coming up in just a few weeks, and you should come up because I think you should sit in with him. Turk had been on a tour, usually started out in Concord, Massachusetts, and he would, apparently during the time of the tour, he was looking for a replacement for Eddie Johnson. Eddie Johnson was an interesting pit trumpet player. He could read anything, but he could not play without music. I was invited to come up and play, and Turk was not too serious about anything until he asked me what I wanted to play with the band. And I said, well, I really like that tune called Red Flannel Rag. And immediately he says, I'm so sorry, the band can't play that now. And he said, what else would you like? And I said, Chimes Blues and Canal Street Blues. Whatever we ended up with, 2 or 3 tunes. That allowed us to have a feeling about what we liked about each other. And of course, I really liked what he was doing. I don't think it was more than a few weeks that had passed after he got done with his tour. I got this invitation, unbelievable invitation, and the numerous letters that came back and forth. I mean, I think I wrote just a couple, but he answered with about 4 or 5, which we have here in our collection. And that's how I ended up in the Turk Murphy Band. This was 1968 in September of '68. And from that point on, I was in for almost 11 years.
He had a couple of guys who were quite young, who he sort of nurtured from being basically like just fresh out of high school.
But one of the substitutes we had who was very, very special was Pops Foster. George Pops Foster was living in town and had been there since the Hangover Club days, which had Earl Hines and Muggsy Spanier, others in the band. He tended to be somebody you would absolutely love to play. I just loved having him in the band. It was so much fun, and he was such a special person to me. We had parties at his house and red beans and rice, and Earl Hines would be there, and as many people that were still part of the area's connection to New Orleans, I think.
And a guy came in one night and he said, guess what? I've been to California, and the Yerba Buena Band is having a reunion, and they made a record, and they're having nights at Earthquake Lagoons. I said, I can hardly believe this.
I met Turk at Disneyland. Of course, I knew of him from the Lou Waters records. Before that, my first exposure to live jazz was the Firehouse 5+2 at Disneyland. And the program they were playing, frankly, I'd heard it all before. It just didn't do anything for me. But I knew Turk was on the program as well, and my dad said, well, why don't we go hear Turk Murphy? So we walked over to Frontierland where Turk Murphy was playing. My dad took me up by the hand to meet Turk on their intermission, and he was as nice as he could be, and stayed a friend right till the end. During the weekend of my high school prom, Turk Murphy had invited the band I was playing in to perform, and no prom was as important to me as playing on the stage at Earthquake Lagoons.
Although he was difficult, he was very loyal and defended and took care of his musicians, and was always defended their right, each musician's right to be a professional musician. And through further exploration of the materials, written and particularly written materials and business records, I have found that that's true, that that's actual, that he really looked out for his people. And although he was hard on musicians, he always defended their right to be musicians, professionals, which is in the era he was active in from the let's say as a band leader from the 40s to the 1980s, was no small thing, because there's always a million things trying to defeat you if you're a professional. And he always made sure he got a living wage, and he always fought and crusaded for making sure musicians could earn a decent living.
Economics is the biggest part. You have to find a place to play, or a place to go to play, like a jazz festival or a jazz club in your town or another town. That's one of the hardest things to do. Find where to play that will make it worth your while, and make it worth your band's while to go play, because you're asking people who make their living playing music to trust in you to provide a living wage.
In the Depression, and the Musicians Union was a very important part of how musicians worked in those days. I can attest to this through my recent exploration into the Turk Murphy Jazz Band business records. He filed a union contract for every job the band ever played. What that means is that lists the musicians on the gig and their social security numbers and what the pay is going to be. If they didn't pay, the union would go after them. There's literally thousands of contracts for gigs in the Jazz Archive. I really think that he believed in the nobility of being a professional musician. And I think that although he was very tough on his people, and he was difficult because he didn't communicate sometimes what he needed, I don't think he ever questioned for 1 second that musician's right to do this for a living.
I wasn't sure that my chops would hold up for in that band 6 nights a week, and yet, you know, it's an average of 6 nights. We had a lot of extras besides playing at Earthquake Magoons, and so I obviously admitted that to Turk, but that was not the problem. I mean, you know, the thing I always could tell is that Turk Murphy's going to play a very strong trombone part, and if I can't be heard detailed above that, then I wouldn't be in that band for very long. So even though the first 6 months I was kind of nursing my chops just to make sure that I could make it through, it turned out that I was one of his strong players, and that's what he had really admired almost more than anything. The compliment Turk paid me early on was he said, you know, you're a throwback. And that meant to him that, he said, it was not a negative. He said, you're a throwback to the sound of horn players that were much earlier than you. And so I took that as a compliment, and then we just beat our way through at least 300 tunes, and within a short time I didn't have any music in front of me at all. I memorized all the tunes and arrangements.
At Earthquake Magoons, there was a music stand in front of each instrument, because he might call something that he hadn't played for a while, and then there was your reference to it written out to the nth degree.
He said the notes that are on the lead sheets for the cornet or trumpet, he said they're not for you. You don't need them. You should interpret the way you interpret, and that the material was for people like Eddie Johnson, who could not play without music or didn't even understand the thing, but he could read like a bandit. So if you know, he knew that he would have times when he has to get somebody at the last minute, maybe somebody's sick or whatever. There weren't a lot of backup people for these positions in his band at that time.
But generally when they went to play, if they played in the Financial District, a noontime concert, or the Concord Jazz Festival, he'd take the music with him, but generally they didn't read it. Turk was such an astute businessman, he wanted everyone on the stage ready to hit when it was time to hit, not waiting for someone to come from the bar or stumble up the stairs.
Jack Crook only left because Turk fired him, because he was, when we were playing up at Lake Tahoe, he was staying up all night gambling, and he started to have heart palpitations, and Turk said, I love you, Jack, but I really need you to be left out of this band from now on, because I don't want you to die on the stage with me.
One of the big problems I definitely noticed in the research I did for the foundation and for the Stanford project was a lot of guys just got fired because they were alcoholics. Alcoholism was the bane of the industry for so many years. It was a struggle for Turk to keep the band going and keep people in the band all the time. For example, the early to mid 60s, people were going in and out of that band constantly. It was like a revolving door, and people would like spend a few weeks in the band and leave. But there were times, say like after 1972, when the band was super stable. And the band after 1980 to about roughly a little bit before the time they went to Carnegie Hall was a pretty stable ensemble too. So also I think Turk himself changed. I think he got to the point where he became a little less mercurial and he settled down himself. Turk was always thinking about ways to get the band's name and music out, partly because he had the club Earthquake Magoons, so he needed to promote his jobs.
He managed to get the respect of many different people, not just musicians, but he had friends that were like Walter Cronkite would come in, and Woody Allen would come in, and he talked Woody Allen into actually having the band that he has right now.
He was able to have a radio show like they had done back in the 1930s and 40s.
From the New Orleans room at the Fairmont Hotel, high atop Nob Hill in San Francisco, See's Candy proudly presents Turk Murphy's San Francisco Jazz Band.
Then later, after he had gotten associated with Chuck Huggins at See's Candy, They started doing a radio show that was on the K-Jazz radio station for years, sponsored by See's Candy, and it was a weekly radio show.
Well, I think it would be accurate to call that a spirited rendition by the Turk Murphy Jazz Band, and we'll hear more from them in just a minute.
It was a staple of radio in the Bay Area.
Cullum put on this whole thing in Carnegie Hall, and Turk was not really well at all at that time, but he came to the top and played amazingly well. Most people wouldn't realize that he was fairly sick at that time.
I really respect Turk for being tenacious and keeping it going for years and years and years, and being so dedicated to it. So dedicated to his vision of what he thought was right musically. And that's something to be deeply admired, and it only made me more steadfast in my vision of what I want to do.
Oh, I mean, I think he was a big guy that played big trombone, and I think he also was so dedicated to what he was doing that I think that came through as well. You know, they said anybody that likes to do this well and is not afraid to stand down from it. I mean, he was a powerhouse.
I bridged the gap between these people who have now gone and the present day, and I managed to put down almost everything they taught me.
Again came the conductor. Again I was cut off. He said, "Pal, I don't know where you got on, but I can tell you where you get off. Well, this train don't carry no gamblers. This train don't carry no gamblers. This train don't carry no gamblers, no crap shooters or midnight ramblers. This train don't carry no gamblers. This